California sells one of the most powerful dreams on Earth. But what happens when the water disappears? The ground moves, and entire communities are forced to start again. Owens Lake was drained until toxic dust began hitting Keela. Oroville's damaged spillway forced nearly 200,000 people to evacuate. Portuguese Bend pushed homes and roads toward the ocean. Fire tore through Malibu, and the San Andreas kept storing pressure beneath the state. Yet people continued building beside every threat. Today, abandoned towns, drowned roads, volcanic peaks, fractured cliffs, and recovering communities reveal a California far removed from the version seen on postcards. Stay with me, because the state everyone thinks they know is about to become almost unrecognisable. Along the edge of Crowley Lake, the shoreline suddenly turns into something that looks like the ruins of a forgotten stone temple, with thousands of pillars rising straight out of the earth. Known as the Crowley Lake Stone Columns, nearly 5,000 of these formations stand in rows, some reaching up to 20 feet tall and connected by natural arches overhead. Nobody carved them. For decades, theories piled up before geologists from Berkeley worked out what had made them. Few people ever see them up close, since reaching the site still means a rough trek by boat, truck, or a long hike across exposed ground. The lake honours Father John J. Crowley, a priest who helped remote desert communities while battling the department that built it, but passed away in a crash before the reservoir ever filled. Today, anglers crowd the lake while the columns remain hidden from most visitors. And farther south, another California town draws visitors by pretending to be a slice of Europe. That plain farming settlement became Solvang, and only decades later did it transform into the windmill, covered storybook village tourists see today. Those dark wooden beams across the storefronts are actually cement mixed with brown dye, built that way because real timber was scarce and expensive. Beneath those cobblestone streets runs a real network of tunnels, and the leading theory says they once moved smuggled alcohol during Prohibition. Solvang even snuck into pop culture. One Simpsons episode reveals Milhouse's uncle lives there, mailing him butter cookies every single year. Bakeries here still guard family recipes passed down for generations, filling the air with the smell of butter cookies and pastries most Americans have never tasted anywhere else. Up the coast, a massive volcanic rock rises straight out of the water, marking the entrance to Morro Bay. Morro Rock is the frozen throat of an old volcano, one in a line of stone plugs that once fed fire into California's central coast. Quarry crews once hacked chunks off its flanks for roads and harbour walls, shaving away pieces of a volcano to build a working waterfront. Across the harbour, 3 concrete smokestacks loom like a second skyline, the last traces of a power plant that used to feed electricity far beyond this small town. Locals joke that rock and smokestacks face each other like 2 rivals, one carved by magma, the other poured by cement trucks, both watching the same narrow harbour mouth. Special estuary protection now forces the bay to juggle fishing boats, tourist piers and old industry without trashing the water they all depend on. Stand along the Embarcadero wharf and the layers line up, cut stone blocks along the shore, rusted plant structures inland, and the volcanic core holding its ground at the harbour entrance. Rock, smokestacks and protected water all collide in this harbour, while far inland, Keela sits stranded beside a lake bed that no longer exists. This unincorporated community once loaded silver onto steamships bound across a full Owens lake, but its old docks now face cracked salt and dry mud where waves used to roll in. When Los Angeles diverted the river into its aqueduct, the lake began to shrink. The trains, warehouses and saloons that depended on its trade slowly emptied and fell into ruin. With the water gone, the exposed lakebed became one of the harshest dust sources in the country, blasting Keela with salty, toxic storms that burned eyes and lungs. Residents learned to track the rising plumes, closing up tight and using oxygen tanks to get through the worst of it. And out on the salt-crusted flats, a pale little shorebird called the snowy plover has adapted to these harsh conditions. Its soft colours match the bleached ground so well that it almost vanishes, with camouflage as its best defence. Food here means tiny bugs and worms, so the snowy plover patrols the damp patches, running, stopping, and pecking at anything small that moves. When dust control crews flooded parts of the dry surface to cut toxic storms, shallow pools and wet mud returned, and the plovers gained new places to feed and rest. Life here still hits hard with salt, wind and watchful hunters, so each bird survives by staying light on its feet and almost invisible on the ground. Farther north, Lake Oroville, a giant reservoir, faces its own battle between flood, drought, and the limits of a concrete dam. A suspension bridge that once soared high above the canyon now hovers surprisingly close to the lake when the water is full, as if the reservoir is trying to nip at its steel belly. Below that surface lie drowned gold settlements, with old foundations, roads and forgotten artefacts resting where boat wakes now roll past. Early planners dreamed of turning Lake Oroville into the Lake Tahoe of the North, with monorails, steam trains, and man-made beaches. But most of it never happened. The lake later made national headlines when heavy rain damaged its spillway, sending water and concrete down the canyon and forcing a massive evacuation downstream. All of this drama funnels into one massive structure below the reservoir, where Oroville Dam rises as the tallest dam in the country and the final gate holding that restless water back. Builders packed so much earth and rock into this wall that laid end to end, the material could form a 2-lane road wrapped all the way around the planet. The whole design balances 3 jobs at once: water storage, flood control, and electricity. And every big storm puts that balance to the test. When the spillway cracked under heavy flows, water ripped chunks out of the hillside and forced a huge evacuation downstream as crews scrambled to keep the dam safe. Rebuilding the spillway took an army of workers and a fresh slab of concrete, and the new chute now cuts across the slope like a permanent scar of what almost went wrong. Engineers still debate how much water this system should release in a worst-case storm, so Oroville Dam remains both a solid wall and an ongoing question about risk. Around its shores, tall trees and dead snags now double as lookout towers for bald eagles, which have turned this big reservoir into one of their favourite fishing spots. Here, they scan the water like careful lifeguards, then drop fast, hooking fish off the surface with claws as sharp as knives. Fish are not their only target here. Bald eagles also single out American coots, those dark swimming birds that look like tiny black boats bobbing across the waves. Once an eagle locks onto a coot, it sweeps low over the flock, and the birds bunch up, splash and scatter, until one straggler breaks away and gets grabbed in a sudden hit. These raptors use brains as much as speed, often waiting near big rafts of coots and ducks, then rushing the group so confusion creates an easy meal. On calmer days, they sometimes swap serious hunting for theft, snatching fish or prey from other birds in midair, like feathered pirates cutting the line. Their white heads and tails shine against the dark trees, but once they fold their wings and drop, each dive is focused and fast, more like a thrown spear than a gliding bird. Some follow rivers and reservoirs across the region as seasons change, tracking fish runs and bird flocks, almost the way commuters track bus routes. Back on the dry side of the mountains, Mono Lake waits with salt-heavy water and stone towers that look more like science fiction than California. The water is so salty and packed with minerals that no fish or frogs can live here, yet swarms of brine shrimp and blankets of alkali flies still flood the shallows. Mark Twain once stood on this shore, tasted the brine, and joked that it was a dead sea, where nothing sensible would choose to swim. Along the edge rise the Tufa towers, limestone spires taller than houses that grew underwater wherever calcium-rich springs pushed up into the lake's chemical soup. For a long time, those towers stayed buried below the waves, until Los Angeles captured the feeder streams, and the lake dropped so far that whole stone forests suddenly lifted into the air. As the shoreline fell back, a dry causeway formed to an island crowded with gulls, and coyotes simply trotted across the new land bridge, as if someone had laid out a free buffet. In a desperate move, crews tried blasting that strip of ground, only to see wind and waves stack fresh sediment and rebuild the path. Years of hearings and court fights finally forced the taps down and set a target level the water was supposed to reach. Those much-loved spires are less a pretty backdrop and more a monument to damage, and even now it is still about 9 feet short of it. South of their one town is actually a puzzle of pieces, with cabins hauled in from places like Whiskey Flat and Claraville and rebuilt board by board. Silver City is a ghost town built from other ghost towns. More than 20 original buildings were hauled here to bodfish from mining camps falling apart across the Kern River Valley. Some of those camps are gone for good. When the river was dammed in the 1950s, the rising reservoir drowned the old town of Isabella completely. In a hard drought, when the lake drops far enough, the rooftops of that sunken town surface again out in the middle of the water. The old jail escaped just before the flood, and the iron rings once used to shackle prisoners are still bolted to its wooden floor. Saving these buildings was slow, heavy work, and more than one slid off its trailer on the way. Nothing is restored. Every warped wall, cracked window, and peeling sign stays exactly as time left it, under a policy known as arrested decay. The water that erased those camps went still behind a dam, while hundreds of miles to the north, another kind of water refuses to stop. MacArthur Burney Falls, Memorial State Park, spreads across the volcanic country between Mount Shasta and Lassen Peak, built around a 129-foot waterfall. The land was handed to California by the MacArthur family in the 1920s, and the memorial in its name honours them. That single gift made it one of the oldest parks in the state system, protected long before most of California was. Today it guards miles of forest and the shoreline of Lake Britain, with the Pacific Crest Trail cutting right through it. The falls behave like almost no other in the state. Most of the water never pours over the top at all. Instead, it seeps from springs trapped inside the porous volcanic cliff and bursts directly through the rock face. Because that supply comes from underground and not from snowmelt, the falls keep a nearly constant flow all year and barely drop even in a hard drought. That steady, spring-fed flow has earned it the nickname, the eighth wonder of the world, for more than a century. Just below the falls, the rushing water settles into cold, clear pools, and one animal reaches them before any other, the river otter. One dive can last several minutes and end with a fish snatched in a turn too fast to follow. The cold water is a constant challenge. Instead of a thick layer of fat, the otter depends on fur so dense that water rarely reaches its skin. It spends hours grooming that coat, because even a small gap can let the cold in. Underwater, it hunts as much by touch as by sight. Long whiskers detect the slightest flick of a fish in murky water, while its nose and ears seal shut before the chase. Fish are its main prey, with crayfish close behind, and its fast metabolism forces it to hunt through much of the day. They live in family groups where the young wrestle, chase one another, and slide down muddy banks in what looks almost like play. The pools the otters work in are ringed by grassy banks, and those banks belong all day to flocks of Canada geese. Here these big grey-brown birds crowd the shoreline with their heads down, grazing almost non-stop. It is a grazer above all, cropping grass, clover, and seeds on shore, then tipping upside down in the shallows for roots and water plants. They are among the few birds equally at home, on land, in water, and in the air, walking, swimming, and flying hundreds of miles with ease. Once a year, the goose is grounded completely. In high summer, it molts every flight feather at once, and the flock clings to open water where it can float away from danger, even while it cannot fly. They are bad-tempered too, quick to hiss and charge and run off a dog or a grown adult that drifts too close. Their young waste no time. Goslings swim within a day, and families often combine into one giant nursery, with dozens of chicks following just a few adults. Those few adults guard the whole crowd for weeks, and the goslings often keep close to their parents for a full year. Eventually, the water these geese ride drains to the open coast, where it once became deadly for the ships that sailed it. One of the first disasters came in 1853, when a brand new clipper ship ran straight onto these rocks on her maiden voyage. The lighthouse here is named after that vessel, the Carrier Pigeon. More than 2 decades later, a 115-foot brick tower rose above the shoreline, one of the tallest lighthouses on the west coast. That first wreck was only the start, and it took 2 more wrecks in the fog and about 50 lives before the government finally built the light. Even its lens has its own history. More than 1,000 hand-cut glass prisms that first shone at Cape Hatteras during the Civil War before being shipped west. The tower itself faced a different problem. Built with a cast iron collar that trapped moisture instead of shedding it, it slowly rusted from the inside out. By 2001, chunks of that iron collar had broken loose and crashed to the ground, and the tower has remained closed to the public ever since. Now a long and costly restoration is bringing it back, a remarkable effort for a landmark many people know only from the roadside. Just beside it, the old keeper's quarters now welcome overnight guests, one of the few lighthouses where visitors can sleep at the foot of the tower. The fog that sank those ships never reached the coves far to the south, where the light did the opposite, and drew painters instead to Laguna Beach. Around the turn of the last century, a single painter arrived, and within a generation, the town was full of them. Before long, Laguna Beach had grown into California's oldest art colony, where at one point more than half the residents painted for a living. Many set up their easels on the cliffs above the surf, chasing the changing light across the water. That tradition lives on every summer in something stranger than any gallery, the pageant of the masters. Real people, painted head to toe, and posed inside full-size copies of famous paintings, hold dead still until the crowd can no longer tell they are alive. Each performer keeps that pose for about 90 minutes without moving. The tradition began in the 1930s as a way to draw visitors after the Los Angeles Olympics. Today, the event draws hundreds of thousands of people each year. Not every landmark along the shoreline celebrates art, though. One stands for something entirely different, a 60-foot stone tower on the sand. Known as the Pirate Tower, it looks as though it belongs in a storybook. Despite its name, it is not a pirate relic at all. Instead, a state senator built it in 1926 as a private staircase from his cliff-top house to the beach, modelled after castles he had seen in France. Its pirate reputation came later, thanks to the next owner, a retired naval captain who embraced the role. He dressed as a pirate and hid coins around the tower for neighbourhood children to find, including what he called cold cash, a handful of change straight from the refrigerator. With the tide, the sea closes over the doorway, leaving the entire tower cut off. Even so, it has outlasted every other private staircase on these cliffs because it was built as a solid stone column, tied to nothing that could wash away beneath it. The pirate legend is little more than harmless make-believe, but farther inland lies a much darker past in Blackstar Canyon. Back then, it bore another name, Cañón de los Indios, meaning the Canyon of the Indians. That changed in 1831 when ranchers from the valley hired a party of American fur trappers to pursue a native band they accused of stealing horses. The trappers followed them into the canyon and attacked them. What happened next is hard to untangle. Nearly every detail comes from a single account, recalled decades later by one of the trappers, blurring the line between history and legend. Ever since, the canyon has kept a haunted reputation, and the rumours have never quite died. Its modern name has a different origin. It comes from a coal mine that operated here in the late 1800s, and rusted iron from that mine still lies scattered through the brush. Around it, the Santa Ana Mountains shelter an animal, just as isolated as this place once was, a mountain lion with nowhere left to roam. Deer are its main prey, and it hunts them by ambush, mostly after dark. An adult male may claim a territory of up to 125 square miles, and he will not share it with another male. But that much space is almost impossible to find here. These mountains are one of the most isolated ranges in Southern California, boxed in by freeways and housing on every side. For a young male searching for territory, the only way out may be across an interstate, 8 to 10 lanes wide, and cars kill more of these lions than anything else. Those that stay face another problem. Penned in with nowhere left to spread out, they often kill one another over territory. What survives is a population among the most genetically isolated anywhere, with one of the lowest levels of genetic variation recorded outside the Florida panther. Kinked tails have begun to appear, and researchers warn the population could be gone within decades. As the mountain lion rules these ridges after dark, daylight reveals an animal small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. The western fence lizard is the small grey reptile doing push-ups on half the rocks and fence posts in Orange County. The males flash the blue patches that earn them the nickname Bluebelly and bob up and down to warn off rivals. Between displays, it basks on warm stone and hunts insects through the coastal scrub. Yet this common lizard does something remarkable. A protein in its blood kills the Lyme disease bacteria inside any tick that feeds on it. After a meal from the lizard, a young tick carrying Lyme leaves cleansed for good, unable to pass the disease on. Because most young ticks here feed on western fence lizards, this ordinary backyard reptile may be the main reason Lyme disease remains so rare across much of California. From those sunlit rocks, the land rises towards something far grander. The highest ground in the contiguous United States stands far to the northeast at Mount Whitney. Nothing else in the lower 48 climbs higher. Its summit rises more than 14,500 feet above sea level on the eastern wall of the Sierra Nevada. From there, the east face drops nearly 2 miles into Owens Valley, one of the steepest descents on the continent. Before it received its modern name, the Owens Valley Paiute called the mountain Tumanguya, the very old man, and believed a guardian spirit watched over them from its summit. Later it was named for Josiah Whitney, the state geologist whose survey crews mapped the Sierra in the 1860s. Even reaching the summit took time. No trail existed until the townspeople below paid for one and carved it themselves in 1904, climbing 99 switchbacks to the highest trail pass in the country. Today, permits are so limited that they are awarded by lottery, and for many hikers that is the hardest part of the journey. Those who make it to the top often begin at 2 a.m. by headlamp, hoping to descend before afternoon storms build. The climb is long and punishing, rising from pine forest into bare rock where summer storms can break without warning. At the summit, a stone hut the Smithsonian built in 1909 for high-altitude research still stands. Below Whitney, the desert floor is strewn with giant rust-coloured boulders. These are the Alabama Hills, thousands of rounded granite boulders in shades of rust and burnt orange, scattered across miles of open desert. At sunrise, they glow beneath the Sierra Nevada, whose granite walls climb 9,000 feet behind them. Warm stone, giving way to snow with almost nothing in between. The Civil War reached even these hills, where rival miners named peaks after the Confederate raider, Alabama, and the Union ship that destroyed it. Long after the war, these boulders found a different claim to fame. Since 1920, more than 400 films have been shot here, most of them westerns. Stars from Gene Autry, Hopalong Cassidy, and the Lone Ranger rode through these rocks, which have also stood in for Africa, Arabia, and India's Khyber Pass. Django Unchained opens here. Tremors was shot almost entirely here, and the Marvel films began here too, with the ambush that opens Iron Man. The town at their edge, Lone Pine, keeps a museum of all of it, down to the 1928 camera car that raced alongside galloping horses. One arch of rock among these boulders pulls in more cameras than any film crew ever did. Mobius Arch is a surprisingly small granite span whose twisted curve resembles a Mobius strip, the one-sided shape that inspired its name. From just the right angle, the opening frames both Lone Pine Peak and Mount Whitney. At sunrise, visitors gather before dawn to watch the first light turn the granite peaks pink, long before it reaches the desert floor. That desert floor hides something they learn to step around carefully once the rock warms. Perfectly matched to the granite, this rattlesnake almost disappears against the tan, grey and orange boulders. As the stone heats up, it stays sheltered until dusk before hunting kangaroo rats, pocket mice, ground squirrels and lizards. Even in total darkness, heat-sensing pits between its eyes and nostrils detect the warmth of nearby animals. It coils beside well-used rodent trails and may wait patiently for days. When the moment comes, the strike is almost too fast to see. The snake releases its prey immediately, follows its scent after the venom takes effect, and swallows it whole. Its rattle is made of hollow keratin segments, with a new one added after every shed, and when threatened, powerful muscles vibrate them into the snake's unmistakable warning sound. That rattle is meant only as a warning, because a snake on the hunt stays silent. Above these rocks, the sound that carries across the desert comes from something else. The California scrub jay is loud, blue and grey, and afraid of very little. It works the oaks and boulders below Whitney Portal and hammers acorns open against the branches. In autumn it buries thousands of them, one at a time, and it remembers where nearly all of them are. There is a catch. If another jay is watching while it hides an acorn, it will come back later, dig the acorn up, and bury it somewhere else. Mostly the birds that do this are the ones that have robbed a cache themselves, which suggests they are judging others by their own record. The acorns it does forget grow into oak trees, so the bird plants the woodland it lives in. South of these oaks, the mountains pinch into a pass that nearly stopped the railroads altogether. The Tehachapi Loop is a spiral railroad track wrapped around a hill, built to overcome a grade too steep for heavy freight trains. To solve the problem, engineer William Hood designed a full circle that gradually lifts the line as it curves around the hillside. On longer trains, the front can pass over the rear as the track crosses above itself. Building it was another challenge altogether. Thousands of Chinese labourers carved tunnels and raised bridges through the pass with little more than hand tools, horse carts and black powder. The work came at a terrible cost. Construction explosions claimed several lives, while many others endured dangerous conditions for less pay than the white crews beside them. Many who survived remained in Kern County, where they built new lives as farmers and ranchers. When the line opened, it completed the final rail link between San Francisco and Los Angeles. Today, dozens of freight trains still wind through the loop each day on a track that has barely changed in almost 100 years. The railroad connected California's growing regions, and farther north, those rails carried something gentler than freight, the grapes that made Sonoma County famous. Today it is one of America's great wine regions, where cool ocean air slips through gaps in the coastal hills each night, creating the climate vineyards depend on. Beyond the vines, the county shifts from redwood-filled canyons to oak-covered hills, with fertile valley floors in between. To the west, a windswept coastline separates Sonoma from the Pacific, and the small harbour at Bodega Bay became famous as the filming location for The Birds. The mystery starts with the name itself. Sonoma's origin remains uncertain, though Jack London's novel made Valley of the Moon the best-known interpretation. Long before Sonoma became known for wine, it briefly became the centre of a revolution. In 1846, a small group of American settlers captured the Sonoma garrison without firing a shot and imprisoned a Mexican general who had just served them breakfast. They raised a handmade flag bearing a grizzly bear and declared the California Republic, which lasted only a few weeks. Earlier still, the county's coast flew under a Russian flag for 30 years. Fort Ross was built in 1812 by the Russian-American company on Kashaya Pomo land called Matini, the southernmost Russian settlement in North America. The first settlers included Russian craftsmen alongside Alaska native hunters, most of them from Kodiak Island. To the Kashaya, those hunters became the underwater people because their skin kayaks rode so low in the water that they seemed to rise straight out of the sea. The colony depended on two things: sea otter pelts and wheat, supplying Russian Alaska with both fur and food. Neither lasted for long. The otters were hunted almost to extinction, while fog, wind, and poor soil frustrated farming. In the end, the Russians sold the settlement to John Sutter and sailed north. Only the last manager's house is original. The chapel and stockade walls stand rebuilt on their original Russian foundations. Along the coast, another ambitious experiment took shape in the 1960s at the Sea Ranch, where houses were designed to disappear into the hills. It began on a stretch of old sheep pasture, where the lead planner walked the coastline and camped there before drawing a single line. That careful approach followed a principle borrowed from the Pomo: live lightly on the land. It shaped every part of the design. Instead of standing out, unpainted redwood was left to weather grey. The buildings borrowed the simple forms of barns and sheds, and cypress windbreaks hid them from the coast. Yet the project came with an unexpected consequence. It also privatised miles of California shoreline. That decision sparked a fight. A Petaluma veterinarian named Bill Cortum first challenged it locally, then carried the battle statewide. The fight reshaped more than Sea Ranch. Proposition 20 created the California Coastal Commission and put shoreline development under public review. In the end, the community built to tread lightly on the land helped inspire the law that protects California's coast. Today, trails lead from the Sea Ranch to the beach, where the water flows south toward Monterey Bay, hiding a massive canyon beneath the waves. Just offshore, the seafloor falls away with surprising speed. Below, Monterey Canyon plunges deeper than the Grand Canyon in places, forming North America's largest submarine canyon on the Pacific coast. Each spring, winds push surface water out to sea, allowing cold, nutrient-filled water to rise from the canyon into the sunlight. That annual upwelling fuels one of Earth's most productive marine ecosystems, supporting giant kelp forests, hundreds of fish species, and dozens of marine mammals. Beneath the Pacific, the extinct volcano known as Davidson Seamount rises from the ocean floor, though its summit remains submerged. At greater depths, scientists discovered the world's largest known octopus nursery, where thousands of pearl octopuses brood their eggs above warm seafloor seeps. Back on shore, the cliffs above the canyon include Pebble Beach, where some of California's most expensive homes overlook the Pacific. The famous golf course winds along the Monterey Peninsula, its fairways perched above the surf and home to some of the world's most photographed holes. Since opening in 1919, it has grown into one of golf's most celebrated courses, becoming the first public layout to host the US Open. Many still consider its 18th hole the finest finishing hole in the sport. Yet the peninsula's most photographed landmark isn't a fairway at all. The lone cypress has clung to a granite outcrop above the ocean for centuries, supported by cables for decades against the relentless coastal wind. Even fire failed to bring it down. An arson attack nearly destroyed the tree, but a neighbour's quick call brought firefighters in time to save it. Its survival is even more extraordinary because Monterey cypress grows naturally in only 2 places on Earth, this headland and nearby Point Lobos. Over time, the tree became the resort's emblem, and while visitors are free to photograph it, selling those images has sparked trademark disputes. A little farther along the coast, the strangest sight on the beach is a ship made of concrete. The SS Palo Alto was built during the First World War, when steel shortages led the government to experiment with concrete shipbuilding. By the time it was finished, the war had already ended, so it never carried cargo and spent years sitting idle. Eventually, an amusement company bought the vessel, towed it to Seacliff, and deliberately grounded it just offshore. There, the deck became an unlikely seaside attraction, with a dance floor, a heated saltwater pool, a cafe, and carnival games drawing crowds to the concrete ship. For a brief time, big bands played above the surf. Then everything changed. Winter storms cracked the hull, and the Great Depression brought the venture to an end. Later, California acquired the wreck for a token price, and the Pacific has been dismantling it ever since, with recent storms destroying the pier that once reached it. What remains today belongs to the seabirds instead, the concrete hull slowly becoming an artificial reef. In the eastern Sierra and away from the coast, Travertine Hot Springs brings water hot enough to scald to the surface. The rock holding these pools was built by the same hot groundwater, which dissolves limestone underground and deposits it at the surface as it cools. Over time, that process has built long parallel ridges and step terraces, streaked with orange, red and white, while heat-loving bacteria add even more colour. The water reaches the surface hot enough to scald before gradually cooling as it flows downhill. Along its course, volunteers have shaped natural channels and soaking pools, where the hottest water stays near the source, and the lower pools become comfortable enough to enter. Despite their popularity, the springs remain undeveloped, unfenced, and free to visit. The heat itself comes from the northern edge of the Long Valley caldera, a volcanic basin left behind by a massive eruption. Across the valley, the snow-covered Sierra Nevada forms a dramatic backdrop, making the rising steam stand out even more during winter. South in the Mojave, the desert heat slowly wore Daggett down to almost nothing. For years, nearly everything hauled out of Death Valley passed through this tiny railroad town. It began as Calico Junction, a railhead built for the booming silver mines in the nearby hills. When the silver ran out, borax became Daggett's lifeline, until that boom faded too, and the town began to shrink again. Route 66 gave it a second chance, carrying travellers through town, while its inspection station later appeared in the Grapes of Wrath. Today, only a few hundred people remain among the old stone hotels, rusting railroad tracks and shuttered buildings. Out in the surrounding scrub, another long-time resident still patrols the desert floor, the Roadrunner. Unlike most birds, North America's largest cuckoo prefers to run, sprinting at speeds of up to 20 miles an hour. It feeds on lizards, mice, insects, and even snakes, getting nearly all its water from its prey, while excess salt drains through glands beside its eyes. Northward, the ground begins to move in Lassen Volcanic National Park. The Atsugewi, Yana, Yahi, and Maidu people believed this mountain held both fire and water, and that one day it would tear itself apart. In 1915, that warning became reality. Lassen Peak blasted ash high into the sky, where it was even seen from the Pacific coast. Soon after, a roaring mudflow swept through the forest below, leaving behind the scar now known as the devastated area. It became the last volcanic eruption in the contiguous United States until Mount St. Helens erupted decades later. One photographer, Benjamin Loomis, stayed through the eruptions, and his images brought the mountain to newspapers across the country. While the volcano was still active, Congress created Lassen Volcanic National Park. The park is unlike any other in the country, containing every major type of volcano, while Lassen Peak remains the world's largest plug dome volcano. Its largest boiling basin is named for a guide who broke through the thin crust into the scalding mud below and suffered life-changing burns. Those eruptions left behind stands of dead trees, creating the perfect home for a bird that has nearly vanished from the forests of the eastern United States. The purple martin, North America's largest swallow, spends most of its life on the wing above those bare trunks. It catches wasps, beetles, dragonflies, and other flying insects without ever needing to land. In the right light, the male's feathers shift from nearly black to a bold blue-purple sheen, while the female is softer, grey-brown with a pale underside. East of the Rockies, the species no longer nests naturally in the wild. Instead, generations have depended on nest boxes and hollow gourds provided by people, a tradition first established by the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee. The Western population never made that change. Here, purple martins still raise their young in old woodpecker holes carved into dead trees, though they now make up only a small share of the species and are considered a bird of special concern in California. With autumn, they depart for the Amazon basin before returning to these same trees each spring. From the volcanic forests, the mountains descend to California's northern coast, where the town of Mendocino overlooks the Pacific from a line of coastal bluffs. This town exists because a ship went down in the fog. In the early days of the gold rush, the brig Frolic struck a reef off Point Cabrillo while carrying silk and porcelain from Canton to California. A foreman sent to salvage the wreck found little of the cargo, but discovered endless groves of giant redwoods just inland, leading to the founding of Mendocino as a logging town. Its first settlers came from New England, bringing white clapboard houses and steep gables that looked more at home on the Atlantic than the Pacific. Wind-powered water towers soon rose across the village, collecting and storing water long before electricity arrived. When the forests were cut over, the mill closed and artists gradually filled the empty buildings instead. Television producers soon discovered the town as well. For more than a decade, it stood in for the fictional main town of Cabot Cove, so a village built to resemble New England ended up playing New England on screen. Ships shaped Mendocino's beginning, and they also gave rise to Point Arena Lighthouse, built to warn sailors away from this unforgiving coast. Just offshore, the San Andreas Fault cuts through the Pacific. When it ruptured in 1906, the original brick lighthouse collapsed, along with much of the nearby town, and both had to be rebuilt. Determined not to lose another tower, the lighthouse service turned to engineers, better known for building factory smokestacks. The result was a reinforced concrete lighthouse, unlike any California had seen before. One part of the original survived, the spiral staircase, which was salvaged and built into the new tower. Now rising 115 feet, it still ranks among the tallest lighthouses on the west coast. Its great Fresnel lens once floated in a bath of mercury, allowing keepers to turn its immense weight with surprising ease. Before electricity, they still had to hand crank a heavy counterweight up the tower every hour or so to keep the light sweeping across the sea. Meanwhile, another California town rose because of the railroad, only to fade when a highway replaced the route that once kept it alive. Goffs existed for one reason: a well that supplied steam engines crossing the Mojave. Gold discovered in the nearby mountains brought miners, and before long the town had a school, homes and businesses. When Route 66 arrived, it became a familiar stop for travellers crossing the desert. A new highway later bypassed Goffs on a shorter route through the Paiute Mountains, giving travellers a faster path and the town little reason to stop. After the school closed, the desert slowly reclaimed the town, though during the war, its empty schoolhouse found one last purpose: as a training site for soldiers in the Mojave. Along the southern coast, change takes the form of one of the state's largest active landslides beneath Rancho Palos Verdes. It sits atop long dormant landslides that had remained still for thousands of years. The most active lies beneath Portuguese Bend, a cove named for Azorean whalers who once hunted grey whales from its shore. Road construction disturbed one of those dormant slopes, setting it back in motion. It has never stopped, damaging homes and roads before heavy winter storms dramatically accelerated the slide, eventually leading to a state of emergency and widespread utility shutoffs. Despite that, the peninsula remains known for its dramatic cliffs, sea caves, and kelp-filled coves, scenery that has doubled for coastlines around the world on film. One of its best-known landmarks was Wayfarer's Chapel, the glass church designed to complement the surrounding hills and trees. Designed by Lloyd Wright, the son of a famous architect, it was built for a small Swedenborgian congregation as a memorial to the theologian Emanuel Swedenborg. Redwood arches and glass walls were arranged so the surrounding trees would eventually become part of the building itself. Known simply as the Glass Church, it became one of Southern California's most popular wedding venues. Its recognition as a National Historic Landmark came just months before disaster struck. As the landslide accelerated, the ground beneath the chapel shifted so quickly that glass shattered, steel twisted, floors cracked, and doors could no longer open. With no way to save it in place, every piece was carefully catalogued, dismantled, and placed into storage, with hopes of rebuilding the chapel on more stable ground nearby. Designed to disappear into its surroundings, the chapel was ultimately claimed by the very hillside it was meant to celebrate. Just down the cliffs, Point Vicente Lighthouse has stood watch over the coast for more than a century, without moving at all. Its tower is surprisingly short, relying on the height of the cliff beneath it to carry the light far out to sea. When the beacon first swept across the lantern room, it cast a tall moving shadow through the windows. That strange motion caught the attention of passing motorists, who became convinced they were seeing a woman walking the gallery, giving rise to the legend of the Lady of the Light. Once the landward windows were painted over to keep the beam from distracting drivers, the mysterious figure disappeared as well. But the lighthouse's most remarkable visitors have always arrived from the ocean below. Each year, grey whales travel along this coast between Arctic feeding grounds and Baja California's warm breeding lagoons, while the Clifftop Visitor Centre keeps count as they pass. For those watching from land, it is still one of the finest places to witness their migration. Away from the coast, the state's changing fortunes are also written inland at Shasta State Historic Park, where a gold rush town survives only through its preserved remains. Shasta began as reeding springs during the gold rush, growing where wagon roads ended and mining trails pushed north into the mountains. Everything the miners needed passed through its streets, and it became the Queen City of the northern mines, before fires swept through the town and forced it to rebuild in brick and iron. Those sturdier materials are why the courthouse, jail, and other restored structures still stand, preserving pieces of the town that once existed here. Its decline came when the railroad chose a different valley and built its terminus at the new town of Redding, drawing away the future this settlement depended on. The railroad took the town's future, but it could not erase the mountain that shares its name, with Mount Shasta still dominating the horizon. It is a massive volcano built from several overlapping cones, rising more than 14,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. One of those cones, Shastina, would rank among the tallest peaks in the Cascades if it stood alone, while glaciers descend from the slopes, including the longest in California. For thousands of years, the mountain has held profound spiritual meaning for the Wintu, Karuk, Modoc, and Shasta people. Its summit is still active, releasing sulfur and steam from beneath the rock, with its most recent eruption recorded in the 18th century. More than a century later, John Muir and a companion were trapped in a freezing storm near the summit, surviving the night in hot sulfur springs, burned on one side and frozen on the other. His account helped spread the mountain's fame, drawing explorers, dreamers, and even those searching for legends hidden inside the volcano. The summit tells a story of fire and ice. Far below, Lake Shasta tells one of rivers, engineering, and a valley transformed. The dam behind it carried the name of the town it was built to erase. Shasta Dam was first called Kennett Dam, after the copper town that once sat upstream, and now rests beneath the reservoir. During dry years, pieces of Kennett return, with old roads and tunnels briefly emerging from the water. Built during the Great Depression and wartime years, the massive concrete wall rose under Hoover Dam's engineer, using one of the longest conveyor systems ever built. When many workers left to serve in the war, women stepped in to help complete the project. The reservoir it created became the largest in California. But the rising water also flooded much of the Winnemem-Wintu homeland, submerging villages, sacred places, and salmon runs central to their way of life. Higher up the mountain, the forest shelters the black-tailed deer, a coastal form of mule deer with a darker coat and a smaller frame. The easiest way to tell it apart is the tail, which is black across the top instead of white with only a dark tip. Its large ears can move independently, with one turning toward a sound behind it while the other scans ahead. Feeding mostly on shrubs and broadleaf plants, it follows the changing snow line through the seasons. Mothers lead their spotted fawns through the forest, teaching them where to graze and search for food. The young stay close to their mothers at first, relying on them to find safe feeding areas and avoid danger. When alarmed, the deer does not simply sprint away. It bounds on all 4 feet at once, clearing brush and uneven ground with ease. That movement, known as a stotting gait, can help it escape predators, but it also signals that it has spotted the threat. Across these forests, its greatest dangers come from habitat loss, vehicle collisions, and predators, such as mountain lions and coyotes, that still follow the deer through its range. For a deer built to survive in mountain forests, every warning, every leap, and every step is part of staying alive. Beyond the trees and trails, another mountain survivor lives among the rocks, built for a world of cold temperatures and constant change. The American pika lives in this maze of boulders, and despite its mouse-like appearance, it is actually a close relative of rabbits and hares. All summer, it clips wildflowers and grasses, carrying each mouthful back to the rocks, where it dries into hay piles that will feed it through the frozen months. Cold is not the danger here. It is well suited to alpine winters, but heat can overwhelm it, forcing brief bursts of activity before retreating beneath the rocks. As temperatures rise, pikas are pushed higher up the mountain, but eventually there is nowhere left to climb. Lower among the conifers, the Steller's jay appears, a bird known for its sharp calls, cleverness, and curiosity toward almost anything in its territory. West of the Rocky Mountains, it is the only crested jay, with a dark head and vivid blue body that make it easy to recognise. Bold and fearless, the bird will snatch food from a picnic table while people are still sitting nearby. That intelligence also shows in its voice, as it can mimic the scream of a red-tailed hawk so convincingly that other birds scatter within seconds. Its name comes from Georg Steller, a naturalist aboard a Russian expedition that reached Alaska in the 18th century. Seeing the jay helped him confirm he had reached North America. Since the bird matched a blue jay illustration, he had studied and looked unlike anything found in Siberia. Although the original specimen was lost when the expedition was wrecked, his notes survived, leaving the bird forever connected to his name. The forests preserve stories of discovery, while places like New Idria reveal a different past, built around one of California's most unusual mining sites. The gold rush needed more than gold, and this remote settlement grew around a metal that helped extract it from ore. Prospectors searching the Diablo Range for silver instead found cinnabar, the bright red ore that led to New Idria becoming one of North America's largest producers of mercury. A company town followed, complete with homes, a school, and a church. But it faded when demand collapsed, and the dangers of the industry became impossible to ignore. The abandoned buildings still stand beside massive waste piles, while lingering contamination leaves the site caught between cleanup and preservation. Mercury was only one resource that shaped California's rise. Another came from beneath the ground in the form of oil. The first offshore oil wells began with an unlikely figure, a spiritualist who founded a coastal community built around seances. Henry Williams created Summerlin near Santa Barbara as a retreat for spiritual gatherings, but the discovery of gas and oil soon changed its future. He extended a pier into the Pacific and placed a drilling rig at the end, creating the world's first offshore oil operation. The idea spread quickly, and soon the coastline filled with more piers and hundreds of wells, while the Los Angeles basin became one of the most productive oil regions on Earth. As cities expanded around the oil fields, the industry moved out of sight. In Long Beach Harbour, artificial islands disguised with palm trees, waterfalls and colourful walls hid the wells beneath them. Those early experiments at Summerlin proved that oil could be reached from the sea, opening the way for the offshore platforms that followed. But in the Santa Barbara Channel, these platforms stand on steel legs anchored into the seafloor, some in waters more than 1,000 feet below the surface. In January of 1969, workers on Platform A were replacing a drill bit when gas and mud surged up the well, causing a blowout offshore. After the well was sealed, pressure beneath the seafloor forced oil through cracks in the rock, allowing it to escape into the ocean for months. The spill spread across hundreds of square miles of water, coating beaches and transforming public attitudes toward offshore drilling. Oil even washed back onto Summerland, the same coastline where offshore drilling had first begun decades earlier. The disaster helped spark a new era of environmental awareness, inspiring the first Earth Day and stronger protections, including a pause on new federal offshore leases along the coast. Oil brought one kind of danger to the coast, but the region's most powerful changes begin far beneath the surface. The San Andreas Fault is not a single crack, but the boundary where the Pacific Plate slowly slides past the North American Plate. It stretches for about 800 miles, from the Salton Sea to Cape Mendocino, with both sides moving only a little each year, while immense pressure builds below. The Carrizo Plain captures that slow motion with unusual clarity, where streams have been pulled sideways, ponds have formed along the fault, and entire ridges no longer line up. One creek has been dragged hundreds of feet from its original course, showing how even solid ground can be reshaped over time. That movement is anything but steady. Long, quiet periods can end in earthquakes powerful enough to shift the land by dozens of feet in a matter of minutes. The fault also creates unusual features such as sag ponds, where shifting ground forms natural basins that fill with water. In places like Hollister, it creeps so steadily that curbs, sidewalks, and even buildings slowly bend out of alignment without a major earthquake. Scientists estimate there is enough stored energy along parts of the fault to produce another major earthquake, yet no one can predict exactly when the next rupture will happen. Not every result of restless geology is destructive. In the northern coast, it helped create a home for the tallest trees on Earth, in Redwood National and state parks. Coast redwoods can grow well over 300 feet, and the tallest known tree stands more than 60 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty after sprouting around the 13th century. Its location is a closely guarded secret because so many visitors once trampled the forest around its base that access is now strictly protected. These giants even help make their own water, catching moisture from the coastal fog and dripping it into the soil during the dry summer months. High above the ground, their massive branches collect enough soil to support ferns, huckleberries, young trees, and even salamanders that spend their entire lives in the canopy. The Yurok, Tolowa, Karuk and Cholula peoples lived among these forests for thousands of years, before logging left only fragments of the old-growth redwoods. Life beneath these towering trees is just as remarkable. Roosevelt elk roam the meadows and forests that stretch between the redwoods. They are the largest elk in North America, with only the moose growing larger among the deer family. A mature bull can weigh over 1,000 pounds, and each year it sheds and regrows enormous antlers that rank among the fastest growing bones in the animal kingdom. By late summer, bugling carries across the prairies as bulls gather harems, challenge rivals, and often stop feeding while the breeding season lasts. That spectacle almost disappeared from California after hunting and habitat loss reduced the population to only a handful of animals. One of the last surviving herds found refuge around Prairie Creek, where dense redwood forests offered shelter and later became part of a protected park. Their recovery has been a conservation success, and Roosevelt elk are now among the most memorable wildlife found beneath these giant trees. The redwoods end where the Pacific begins, and California's coastline continues as a chain of cliffs, beaches, and rocky headlands. The shoreline stretches from the Oregon border to Mexico, but with its bays, islands, and winding inlets included, it extends for thousands of miles. It is also a coast still under construction, lifted by shifting tectonic plates, even as waves carve it into cliffs, sea arches, and broad rock shelves. Almost everything inland eventually finds its way here, as rivers, fog, sediment, and even traces of the state's mining and oil history flow toward the Pacific. Public access has long been protected, with hundreds of marked trails leading to beaches open below the high tide line, regardless of who owns the land above. That shared shoreline curves around San Francisco Bay, where one of the West Coast's great natural harbours helped shape California's history and economy. On its eastern shore stands Richmond, a city whose story has been defined by both heavy industry and economic hardship. The railroad arrived first, followed by a massive oil refinery, but the Second World War transformed it into one of the nation's busiest shipbuilding centres almost overnight. New construction methods sped up shipbuilding, drawing tens of thousands of workers and transforming the city's population, neighbourhoods, and workforce. The wartime boom left lasting changes, from childcare and early prepaid healthcare to communities that faced inequality long after the shipyards closed. That same waterfront that launched Liberty ships now leads to the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, spanning the broad northern reach of San Francisco Bay. Rather than running straight across the water, the bridge bends and rises to cross two busy shipping channels, giving it the rolling profile that earned it the nickname the roller coaster. Its matching high spans were built to the same design to reduce construction costs, leaving the roadway to dip between them before climbing again. The crossing has served more than traffic, carrying a temporary water pipeline during a severe drought, before later adding a protected path for cyclists and pedestrians. Across the water at the far end of that bridge is San Quentin State Prison, the oldest prison in California. It opened in the early days of statehood, where the first prisoners built the prison themselves before spending each night aboard a prison ship anchored offshore. Later it became home to the nation's largest death row, welcomed performances by both Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard, and has recently begun shifting its focus toward rehabilitation. One place was built to confine people by design. Another became famous for a design that seemed to defy logic, the Winchester Mystery House. After buying a modest farmhouse, Sarah Winchester spent the rest of her life expanding it into a mansion with more than 160 rooms, countless staircases, and thousands of panes of glass. Largely self-taught, she constantly redesigned the house, adding innovations such as push-button lighting, a floating foundation, and a water reuse system. Still, one mystery remains. The number 13 appears throughout the house, from bathrooms and staircase steps to hooks in the séance room, and no one knows why. Elsewhere, another place carried equally ambitious hopes. Vallejo was once expected to become California's permanent capital. That vision faded when construction stalled, living conditions failed to meet expectations, and promised financial support never fully materialized. The United States Navy, however, found a lasting foothold here when Mare Island opened as its first Pacific base in the early years of statehood. Over the next century, the shipyard became one of the West Coast's key naval facilities, building hundreds of vessels, repairing more, and later specializing in submarines. Wartime demand transformed Vallejo, bringing thousands of workers and turning the small city into a major industrial hub before the shipyard eventually declined. After the base closed, the island passed to the city, with its historic buildings, aging docks, and the environmental challenges left behind by generations of industry. Unfortunately, prosperity was never shared equally across Vallejo, and after the shipyard closed, some neighbourhoods bore far more of the burden than others. The Navy's departure cost thousands of jobs, and within a decade, Vallejo became one of the first cities of its size to file for bankruptcy, forcing major cuts to public services. Poverty persisted as rising housing costs, driven by Bay Area wealth, outpaced local wages, while homelessness grew along Sonoma Boulevard and the downtown waterfront. From struggling neighbourhoods to a restored shoreline, the coast keeps changing, and Avila Beach stands as one of its most dramatic recoveries. Saving this town meant tearing much of it down and rebuilding from the ground up. Avila Beach curls into San Luis Bay behind Point San Luis, which shields it from strong waves and creates some of the calmest waters on the coast. The Chumash lived along this bay, and the piers date back to the 19th century, when it functioned as the shipping port for San Luis Obispo. Then oil transformed the shoreline. Union Oil built a tank farm on the bluff and sent crude to the pier through pipes running beneath Front Street. For decades, those pipes leaked, and tar repeatedly washed onto the sand, leaving evidence of the contamination behind. The turning point came when polluted land became nearly impossible to sell or finance. Lower Front Street was removed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of contaminated soil were hauled away, and only 2 buildings were saved and rebuilt: the market and the yacht club. When the work was completed, Avila Beach reopened as a town rebuilt above a cleaner shoreline. In another coastal town, Fort Bragg sits on a coastline shaped by timber, tides, and decades of change, with its old industrial waterfront now transformed. The name came from a military post built during a turbulent period, though the land had long belonged to the Pomo people who lived along this coast for generations. A reservation was created at the Noyo River's mouth, where a small army camp was later named for Braxton Bragg, a future Confederate commander. The fort did not last, and after the reservation was closed, the land was open to settlers, and the region shifted toward logging. A sawmill arrived with a railroad that carried redwood out of the inland forests, connecting Fort Bragg to the wider economy. That line still runs today as the Skunk Train, named after the gas-powered rail cars of the early 20th century that passengers joked they could smell before they arrived. The earthquake of 1906 destroyed much of the mill and downtown, but the town rebuilt quickly and helped supply the lumber used to reconstruct San Francisco. Fort Bragg's industrial past left behind more than old rail lines. It created Glass Beach, one of California's most unusual shorelines. What appears to be a natural treasure was once a dumping ground where the town discarded generations of waste, from bottles and dishes to appliances and abandoned vehicles. Locals called it the dumps, and fires were often set on the pile to burn away the volume of trash. The site closed in the late 1960s, and cleanup crews removed the larger debris, leaving behind only the fragments that the ocean would slowly transform. Over time, waves polished the broken glass into smooth pieces scattered across the shore in shades of green, amber, white, and rare flashes of blue and red. Collecting the glass is now prohibited, but pieces continue to disappear as visitors carry them away, slowly eroding the very feature that made this accidental beach famous. The coast eventually reaches Santa Barbara, where an earthquake, a distinctive architectural style, and the rise of offshore drilling transformed the city. The city sits between the Santa Ynez Mountains and the Pacific, on a coastline that runs east to west instead of north to south. That unusual angle gives it southern exposure and a climate often compared to southern Europe, inspiring the nickname the American Riviera. The Chumash lived here for generations before the Spanish established a presidio in the colonial era. By the early 20th century, leaders had begun planning a downtown revival based on Spanish architecture, but the idea struggled to gain support. Then one morning in the 1920s, the ground shook for less than a minute. The earthquake destroyed much of the business district, damaged a nearby dam, and flooded parts of the city. Few lives were lost because the disaster struck before most residents had started their day. The destruction turned the old architectural vision into a rebuilding plan, led by Pearl Chase and later protected by the city's design review system. Even the streets carry traces of the past, with a crooked layout left behind by a surveyor whose measuring chains changed length with the weather, and a street that still bears his name. The city's Spanish Revival style drew inspiration from older landmarks, especially Old Mission Santa Barbara, one of the earliest missions built in the region. The landmark that inspired so much of the city's architecture was already more than a century old. Founded in the late 18th century as the 10th mission in the chain, it is the only one still operated by the Franciscans without interruption, earning the title Queen of the Missions. The stone church standing today was built in the early 19th century by Chumash workers under a master stonemason, on land their people had known for generations. Mission records document thousands of baptisms and burials, preserving a complicated history of faith, labour, and cultural change. In the 1820s, the Chumash rose against the mission system, and Santa Barbara was among the sites affected by the uprising. After Mexico secularized the missions, the church eventually returned to Franciscan control later in the century. The towers collapsed in the 1925 earthquake and were rebuilt soon after. Later, structural problems forced another reconstruction, so the familiar facade seen in photographs is a recreation of an earlier version. And if there's one thing the rebuilding ever produced, it's the courthouse, where Santa Barbara turned its Spanish vision into one of California's most distinctive civic buildings. Completed in the late 1920s after the earthquake, it occupies an entire city block and continues as both a landmark and a working courthouse, with a jail wing still inside. Its tower rises above the city and is open for anyone willing to climb it. Inside, the building reveals hand-painted ceilings, wrought iron chandeliers, and decorative tiles brought from Tunisia and Spain. The mural room surrounds visitors with a painted version of the region's history, one that celebrates its past while leaving out some of the harder chapters. Above the clock gallery, the ceiling shows the exact arrangement of stars on the night explorers gave this coast the name Santa Barbara. Beneath it, the clock dates from the building's opening era and remains one of the country's few surviving mechanisms of its kind still in operation. Every detail inside the courthouse reflects Santa Barbara's carefully shaped identity. In the opposite direction, Stearns Wharf extends into the water, the oldest working pier in the state, and the structure that first connected the city to the world. Before it existed, Santa Barbara had no easy way for ships to reach shore. The shallow waters forced vessels to anchor offshore, with cargo and passengers carried in by smaller boats. A lumberman named John Stearns changed that by building a wharf that reached far enough into the bay for ships to dock directly. For decades, it handled the freight and travellers that helped pull the town out of isolation. The pier is still the oldest working wooden wharf in California, with cars continuing to drive across its weathered planks. That makes the trip out feel unusual, a modern road leading onto a structure built in another era. The protection it needed came later, just west along the coast, where Santa Barbara Harbour created a sheltered home for boats behind a wall of rock. A breakwater reaches into the sea, softening the waves and forming a safe harbour for vessels along the coast. The harbour supports the local fishing fleet, while whale-watching boats set out from here during migration season. Offshore, grey whales pass through the channel each year as they travel between northern feeding grounds and southern breeding waters. The harbour's most familiar visitors, however, are far less graceful. California sea lions take over the docks and buoys, squeezing into every available spot and turning the waterfront into their own resting colony. They lounge across boat rails, swim steps, and even one another, often just a few feet from people walking along the shore. Yet another traveller arrives on this coast each winter, one far smaller than a sea lion, but facing a much greater struggle: the monarch butterfly. Santa Barbara County has long been home to one of the largest gatherings of western monarchs along the coast. Each winter, they settle into sheltered groves, often clustering in eucalyptus trees that were introduced from elsewhere. At their peak, entire branches would bend under the weight of thousands of butterflies. The population once numbered in the millions along the coast, but by 2020, only a tiny fraction remained. numbers briefly climbed again in the following years, offering hope that the decline might be reversing. That recovery was short-lived, and the latest count found the population had fallen sharply once more. The western monarch has fallen far below its historic levels, with scientists warning that the migration could disappear within decades. At Elwood Mesa, one of the county's best-known butterfly groves, some winter days have brought observers to a troubling sight, only a few monarchs arriving where thousands once gathered. Past the groves that shelter migrating monarchs, East Oakland shows another side of urban change, where neighbourhoods have faced decades of disinvestment and renewal. The flatlands grew around the Oakland Assembly Plant, Northern California's first major auto factory, which once supported local businesses, shops and workers. When the plant left and later developments declined, investment faded, but residents kept organising through movements, legal fights and projects to strengthen the neighbourhood. Industrial decline also transformed Bayview Hunters Point, a waterfront neighbourhood defined by shipyards, pollution and redevelopment. The southeastern edge of San Francisco was built around Hunters Point, where a dry dock operated before the Navy expanded the site into a major wartime repair yard. Thousands of workers found jobs there, including black families who arrived from the south as wartime industries drew people west. Housing policies later confined many of those families to Bayview Hunters Point, creating a community that still has one of the city's largest black populations. After the war, the Navy added a new role to the shipyard, using part of the site to study the effects of nuclear weapons. When contaminated ships returned from the Bikini Atoll tests, workers removed radioactive material and handled waste without fully understanding the risks. The consequences reached far beyond the shipyard fence, shaping a neighbourhood where disinvestment and inequality became part of daily life. Over time, those impacts became impossible to ignore, and it became a Superfund site, with decades of waste leaving behind asbestos, PCBs and radioactive contamination. The cleanup later faced scrutiny after investigators found falsified soil samples, leading to criminal charges, settlements, and millions spent on efforts residents say failed to protect them. Today, the community continues to carry that burden, facing higher rates of poverty and health problems, while residents push for further testing and accountability. Then the shoreline reaches Carlsbad, where a once quiet coastal community became known for tourism, agriculture, and innovation. Long before it carried a European name, this coast and its lagoons were home to the Luiseno people. The name Carlsbad came later, borrowed from the famous spa town of Carlsbad in Bohemia, after local mineral water was found to resemble its springs. A retired sea captain named John Fraser discovered the water on his farm and began offering it to travellers at the nearby railroad stop, where many came seeking its supposed healing powers. Tests sent to laboratories confirmed similarities with the Bohemian spa water, inspiring the settlement to adopt the Carlsbad name and build a hotel beside the spring. The hotel eventually burned down, but the mineral water continued to be sold across the country for decades. More than a century later, a sculptor from the original Carlsbad honoured the connection by sending a bronze statue of Captain Fraser back to the California town that borrowed its name. The town's reputation eventually grew beyond its spa, as agriculture transformed the surrounding hills into one of the region's most recognisable displays of flowers. Here, the colourful blooms come from a cultivated variety of ranunculus that no longer exists in the wild in this form. Descended from a simple wildflower native to Asia Minor, the modern ranunculus owes its dense layers of petals to decades of careful breeding, rather than nature alone. Each spring, the hills burst into colour for only a short season before the flowers are ploughed back into the soil, beginning the cycle all over again. The hills eventually meet Carlsbad Lagoon, where freshwater and seawater come together in one of the region's most important coastal estuaries. In fact, Carlsbad is home to 3 coastal lagoons, Agua Hedionda, Batiquitos and Buena Vista, stretching one after another just inland from the Pacific. Because tides flow in and out each day, these wetlands are neither fully freshwater nor fully marine, creating conditions that support an exceptional variety of life. Migrating shorebirds stop here to rest along the Pacific Flyway, while several threatened and endangered species also depend on the lagoons year-round. One lagoon supports oyster farming, another helps raise young white sea bass, and the calm water has also become a favourite place for paddlers. Despite the nearby freeway and growing city, these sheltered estuaries remain one of the quietest corners of the coast. Among the many animals that rely on them is one of the smallest and fastest, Anna's hummingbird. The male's brilliant rose-coloured crown and throat contain no pink pigment at all. Instead, microscopic feather structures reflect that colour only at certain angles, so a slight turn can make the dazzling feathers appear almost black. Females lack the male's vivid iridescent head, wearing mostly soft green and grey plumage, with only small patches of red on the throat. Both of them spend their days darting between flowers, drinking nectar and catching tiny insects in midair for the protein they need. During courtship, the male climbs high above the ground before diving at remarkable speed. Near the bottom of the dive comes a sharp, loud chirp that does not come from his voice. Instead, the sound is produced by the outer tail feathers as they flutter through the rushing air. Measured against its own body length, the dive ranks among the fastest movements ever recorded for any vertebrate. On cold nights, the bird enters a state of torpor, slowing its body dramatically and letting its temperature fall until sunrise. The same coastline that supports wetlands and wildlife eventually reaches San Diego Bay, where the Coronado Bridge links two shores across the harbour. Its sweeping curve was shaped by engineering, not appearance. The Navy required enough space beneath the bridge for its ships to pass, even though both ends begin almost at sea level. A straight bridge would have been too steep, so engineers added the graceful bend to lengthen the crossing and create a gentle climb. The design provides clearance for many large naval vessels while preserving an easy drive across the bay. Its architect had trained under Frank Lloyd Wright and gave the towers a form inspired by an earlier bridge in Balboa Park. For years, rumours claimed the bridge had been designed to float away or be demolished to keep the fleet from being trapped inside the harbour. Despite the story's popularity, no engineering records have ever supported that claim. South of the bridge lies the Coronado Cays, a chain of artificial islands built where open water once filled the bay. The community was created by dredging channels and using the excavated sand to form a series of small islands connected by roads and bridges. Instead of ordinary streets, much of the neighbourhood is organised around man-made canals that bring the bay to people's back doors. Many homes have a driveway facing the street and a private dock on the opposite side, allowing residents to keep boats just steps from their living rooms. Those waterways flow directly into San Diego Bay, creating one of the few residential marina communities of its kind in the state. The coast soon reveals La Jolla Cove, a sheltered inlet whose calm waters support an exceptional variety of marine life. Its small size is exactly what makes it so unusual, with sandstone cliffs wrapping around the cove and protecting it from much of the incoming surf. That natural shelter creates some of the clearest water in Southern California, It also makes the cove a gateway to the San Diego La Jolla Underwater Park, where snorkelers, divers and kayakers explore the protected marine reserve year-round. Sea caves carved into the surrounding cliffs add another layer to the coastline, while underwater reefs and kelp forests provide habitat for countless fish and other marine animals. The rocky shoreline belongs to the sea lions and harbour seals, which haul out here in every season and have become one of La Jolla's best-known attractions. Out past the kelp forests, common bottlenose dolphins travel in social groups, surfing breaking waves, herding fish together, and sometimes racing alongside boats for miles. These dolphins live along the Southern California coast year-round, often hunting so close to shore that they can be watched directly from the beach. Working as a team, they drive schools of fish into shallow water before taking turns feeding, making each hunt far more effective than going alone. Every individual also develops a unique signature whistle as a calf, keeping it for life while other dolphins use it much like a personal name. Courtship can last for days, with males swimming beside females, synchronizing their movements, and repeatedly showing off their speed and agility. Females usually give birth to a single calf after about a year of pregnancy, and mothers stay closely bonded with their young, teaching them how to hunt, navigate, and survive in the ocean. A dolphin riding the bow wave of a moving boat is not simply playing, but conserving energy by letting the pressure wave carry it forward with very little effort. Long before boats existed, they were already doing the same thing alongside whales, taking advantage of the waves created by much larger animals. For many visitors, however, the greatest attraction along this coast is not what swims offshore, but what ends up on the plate. One of San Diego's best-known creations is the California burrito, which wraps carne asada, cheese and French fries into a single tortilla, making the fries part of the meal itself. Local taquerias popularised the combination, and before long it had spread far beyond the city, with versions now appearing across the southwest. Not long afterward came carne asada fries, which took the same ingredients and served them over a plate of fries instead of inside a tortilla. Like many of San Diego's signature foods, the exact origin is still debated, with several taquerias claiming to have created the originals. Food is only part of the city's identity. San Diego has also become one of America's leading craft beer capitals, where hundreds of breweries help define the bold, hop-forward style known as the West Coast IPA. Many other local favourites also reflect the city's close ties to Mexico, from fish tacos inspired by nearby Ensenada to rolled tacos that became popular while feeding wartime workers. Together they tell the story of a border city that keeps adapting familiar ideas into something distinctly its own. Beyond San Diego, Los Angeles stands today as one of the world's most influential cities, built by global migration, booming industries, and steady growth. It began as a small farming settlement beside the Los Angeles River, founded under Spanish rule, with a name later shortened to the two letters recognized around the world today. Long before that, the Tongva and Chumash peoples had lived across this region for thousands of years, shaping the land long before European settlement. The arrival of the railroad transformed the area into one of the fastest growing cities in the country, replacing orchards and ranches with an ever-expanding metropolis. Although the city was founded on a river, most of its course now flows through a concrete channel built to control destructive floods. Los Angeles is also one of the world's most culturally diverse cities, where people from more than 100 countries have shaped its neighborhoods, food, music, and traditions. It continues to be the global centre of film and television, but its economy now also depends on technology, international trade, aerospace, fashion, and scientific research. Few places have appeared on screen more often, and generations of filmmakers have reshaped the city's image until fiction and reality often seem to overlap. Behind that image, the city also faces severe housing inequality and homelessness, where great opportunity exists alongside visible hardship. High above the city, Griffith Observatory was built to bring astronomy within everyone's reach, reflecting the belief that science and education should be open to the public. Since opening in the 1930s, its rooftop telescope has remained free for anyone willing to wait their turn, making astronomy accessible to millions of visitors rather than just scientists. On clear evenings, visitors can observe the moon, planets, and distant stars through a telescope the observatory says has welcomed more visitors than any other public telescope in the world. The Art Deco building, crowned by weathered copper domes, also offers one of the city's most recognisable views, stretching from downtown Los Angeles to the Pacific on a clear day. Its hilltop setting has made it a favourite filming location, appearing in classics like Rebel Without a Cause and modern films such as La La Land. And just a short drive west, the scenery changes completely, where the Venice canals were built to recreate a small piece of Italy on the southern California coast. A small network of the original canals still winds through a residential neighbourhood, surviving long after most of the waterways were filled in and paved over. Graceful footbridges cross the water, while ducks, kayaks, and small boats share channels lined with gardens and waterfront homes. From the canals, the cottages appear simple and peaceful, but many sit on some of the most valuable residential property in Los Angeles. Yet these waterways were only one part of a far grander vision imagined by their founder, who intended to build an entire seaside city inspired by Venice, Italy. The original seaside vision expanded into Venice Beach, which grew into one of the city's most recognisable destinations for art, recreation, and street culture. Abbot Kinney wanted to build a version of Venice in California, and he took the idea almost literally. He created a coastal resort with canals, imported gondoliers, and grand arcades meant to bring European elegance to the shoreline. The plan attracted attention, but it was the pier, amusement rides and beach crowds that truly captured people's interest. As the resort changed, many of the waterways were filled in and replaced by streets, leaving only a small trace of the original design. What emerged instead was a famous boardwalk where performers, artists, athletes and vendors turned the beachfront into a living stage. Bodybuilders train in the open air, musicians and street artists compete for attention, and shops selling everything from souvenirs to tattoos line the path. That coastal spirit continues across the water at Santa Catalina Island, where clear waters, wildlife, and a distinct island character draw visitors year-round. It stretches across mountainous terrain with one main town, Avalon, tucked along its harbour. The chewing gum magnate William Wrigley Jr. took control of the island in the early 20th century and transformed it into a seaside retreat. The round white building dominating Avalon's waterfront is known as the Casino, though its name has nothing to do with gambling. In Italian, the word simply means a gathering place, and inside are a grand ballroom and theatre that once hosted famous big bands broadcast across the country. While Catalina became a destination for escape, the mainland developed an identity built around something people could take home: Los Angeles food culture. The story begins with a small roadside burger stand in Baldwin Park that opened in the late 1940s. In-N-Out grew slowly, keeping its focus close to home, rather than expanding everywhere at once. Its menu stays simple, while the unofficial items known as the secret menu have become part of the experience for long-time customers. The city also changed sushi with the creation of the California roll, which placed rice on the outside and used avocado to mimic the creamy texture of traditional tuna. The exact origin is still debated, with competing claims from chefs in Los Angeles and Vancouver, but the result is undeniable. That single adaptation helped introduce sushi to diners who once avoided raw fish. Meanwhile, Koreatown, neighbourhood taquerias, and immigrant communities continued reshaping the city's food scene, helping dishes like birria tacos grow from local favourites into global sensations. The flavours that define Los Angeles come from the people who built the city, creating a culture shaped by migration, creativity, and countless traditions. It grew through waves of newcomers, becoming home to the largest Mexican-born population outside Mexico City, and one of the West Coast's largest black communities. Those communities also carried struggles that shaped the city's identity. In the summer of 1965, a traffic stop involving a young man named Marquette Fry in Watts escalated into days of unrest after a crowd gathered around the arrest. The violence claimed dozens of lives and exposed deeper frustrations over unemployment, housing discrimination, and unequal schools. A state commission later concluded that the confrontation was only the spark, while years of social and economic pressure had already built beneath it. Decades later, Los Angeles faced another major uprising after the Rodney King verdict, again revealing the tensions that remained across many neighborhoods. Yet those same communities also gave the world new forms of expression, from hip-hop and rap that transformed global music to skateboarding culture that grew from the streets of Venice. The city still carries sharp contrast today, with immense creativity existing alongside one of the largest populations of people living without shelter in the country. Away from the streets and neighbourhoods, another force helped build the region from the ground up, the farms and agricultural valleys that fueled its rise. California became one of the world's great agricultural centres, producing a major share of the nation's vegetables, fruits and nuts. Much of that success came from the labour of people who worked the land without ever being allowed to own much of it. Chinese workers helped drain and reshape wetlands into farmland, only to face laws that later prevented many from owning the fields they created. Japanese farmers built successful operations before their land was taken when they were forced into camps during World War II. Filipino labourers carried much of the harvest work, while Mexican farm workers became the backbone of the agricultural industry for generations. Families fleeing the Dust Bowl arrived in the West and entered a system that had already been built on unequal access to land and opportunity. For more than a century, these farms have helped feed the country through the effort of workers whose contributions often remained overlooked. That relationship between people and the land continues beyond the fields, where tree farms grow instead of crops. These are not forests, but carefully designed orchards where rows of trees stretch across the valley floor. Most are almond trees, planted in precise grids that allow machinery to move between them during harvest. Each winter, before the leaves appear, the trees burst into white blossoms that briefly transform the valley into a sea of flowers. Almonds cannot pollinate on their own, so beekeepers bring in hives from across the country to provide the pollinators needed for the bloom. For a short time, millions of managed bees become part of California's agricultural system before the hives move on to the next crop. Once the blossoms fade, the trees begin the long process of producing the nuts that support one of the state's most valuable farming industries. Eventually, even these tree farms reach the end of their cycle, and old trees are cleared to make way for new plantings. The orchards represent only one part of agricultural farmlands, where countless crops and farming methods support a massive food network. From high above, the valley does not look like a farm at all, but a patchwork of perfect circles spread across the flat ground between the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Ranges. Each circle is created by a massive irrigation arm that slowly rotates around a central well, watering crops in a precise pattern. The machines reach only as far as the arm can travel, leaving the untouched corners as empty patches between fields. Across this region, cotton, tomatoes, corn, rice and almonds fill millions of acres of some of the most productive farmland on Earth. Yet this abundance depends on a constant supply of water, something the dry climate cannot always provide. Even with modern machinery, much of the harvest still depends on workers moving through the fields by hand. The open spaces that support agriculture also make room for wind farms, where towering turbines capture the power of moving air. The first major wind projects rose in 3 mountain passes, where geography speeds up the breeze: Altamont, Tehachapi, and San Gorgonio. Air moving between the hot interior and cooler coast is forced through these gaps, creating some of the strongest and most reliable winds in the state. Tehachapi became one of the earliest large-scale wind energy centres in the country, while its surrounding hills now hold one of the largest wind installations in America. Altamont, however, revealed the risks that came with the early technology. Its smaller, faster spinning turbines were placed along a major raptor migration route, leading to large numbers of hawk and eagle deaths before the site was redesigned. Many older machines have since been replaced by taller turbines with slower blades that generate more power while reducing impacts on wildlife. Wind now supplies a meaningful share of California's electricity, but the state's biggest renewable source comes from somewhere else entirely: the sun. Across dry valleys and desert plains, enormous solar farms stretch across the ground, converting intense sunlight into electricity for millions of homes. The largest installations rise where the desert begins, especially across the Mojave Desert and Imperial Valley, where rows of panels cover the open land for miles. These massive solar fields capture the same sunlight that has long shaped the desert climate, converting it into power for cities far beyond the horizon. California produces more solar energy than any other state, and on clear afternoons, solar generation can exceed what the grid can immediately absorb. Without enough transmission lines or storage capacity, some of that electricity has nowhere to go and must be turned off. In recent years, millions of megawatt hours of renewable energy have been wasted despite already being generated. The challenge is no longer finding sunlight or building solar farms. It is storing that energy and delivering it when people need it most. San Bernardino grew within this inland corridor, shaped by energy projects, transportation routes, and decades of urban expansion. For generations, 3 industries kept the city moving, but each one eventually faded away. The railroad and Santa Fe repair shops once anchored the local economy, but that foundation weakened after Kaiser Steel in nearby Fontana closed and railway operations declined. Then came the closure of Norton Air Force Base, removing another major source of employment and leaving the city searching for a new economic direction. The losses eventually pushed San Bernardino into bankruptcy, and recovery has yet to reach many residents facing poverty and homelessness. Away from factories, rail lines, and warehouses, wine country reflects communities formed by generations of growers, winemakers, and seasonal labour. A turning point came when a Paris wine merchant organised a blind tasting that changed how the world viewed California wine. He placed bottles from the state alongside top selections from Bordeaux and Burgundy, then handed them to French judges without revealing the labels. When the results were announced, wines from the region had won both categories, shocking the industry and proving they could compete with Europe's most respected producers. The French press largely dismissed the outcome, but the rest of the world paid attention, and the reputation of New World wine began to shift. Napa became the symbol of that victory, even though Sonoma supplied much of the grapes behind the winning white wine. Vines had arrived here with Spanish missionaries centuries earlier, but for generations, wine from the region was largely a local product. Today, the state produces the majority of wine made in the United States, with vineyards stretching across dozens of recognised regions. They run from the northern border to the southern edge, where a different battle over land and resources unfolds in Malibu. The name comes from a Chumash word describing waves crashing on shore, while the village of Humalua once stood at Malibu Lagoon for thousands of years. Modern conflicts began when Frederick Ringe bought the Malibu Ranch in the late 19th century, and his wife May later fought to keep outsiders from crossing it. She hired guards, challenged trespassers, and even built her own railroad to block Southern Pacific from cutting through the coastline. The fight reached the Supreme Court, but the railroad won, opening the road that connected Malibu to the coast and helped make it a celebrity haven. That same coastline faced a new challenge when the Palisades fire spread west from the hills, destroying thousands of buildings and leaving communities along the shore to rebuild. The Pacific Coast Highway became both a lifeline and a symbol of the damage, with repairs continuing as residents returned to restore what was lost. The Coast Highway was shut for months, and a year later, it was still a construction road, with the town rebuilding along it. Malibu's identity became closely tied to surfing, and Surf Rider Beach emerged as one of the most influential places in the sport's history. The wave here breaks to the right and holds its shape for a remarkably long ride. Located at the mouth of the lagoon, Surf Rider is a point break where swells wrap around the shoreline and peel smoothly instead of collapsing all at once. That rare shape allowed surfers to develop a style built around patience, balance, and long rides. Modern surf culture took form here in the middle of the 20th century, with longboards, nose riding, and the relaxed style that defined the era. Before easy access roads arrived, surfers slipped through a gap in the fence at the old pottery works to reach the beach. From the shore, the mountains rise into Malibu Creek State Park, where protected terrain stretches inland beyond the coastal homes. The park follows a dramatic gorge of pale rock, oak woodland, and chaparral, with Malibu Creek winding through its centre. For nearly a century, Hollywood has used these settings as a natural backdrop. The Rocky Canyon became the setting for the original Planet of the Apes and countless other productions. Wildlife still moves through the same scenery, with red-tailed hawks circling the ridges and mule deer coming down to the water. Mountain lions also pass through the area, using the Santa Monica Mountains as a corridor between remaining pockets of open habitat. And it lies a few miles from some of the most expensive real estate on Earth, which is the whole of California in one place. This is California, a land of hidden wonders and remarkable architectural marvels. Now, if you don't want to miss the most unreal wonders of the Southern Appalachian, check out this video.